So we are going to talk today, we've been talking about the Industrial Revolution, and we've only dealt so far, I think, in the positives, in the industrial growth, in the economic growth that we would see in Western Europe, in the stretching of railroads across Western Europe, and how new products were going to be created and new markets were going to be used to sell those products. Thank you. Here now, though, we need to talk about how this Industrial Revolution is going to have some negative effects, and there will be various responses to industrialization in the 19th century. Pardon me. I'm going to talk about a few attempts that were made to lessen the destructiveness of industrialization, especially for those workers. All right. First, I want to talk about something called utopian socialism. Now, we've mentioned the word utopia before. This came around when we talked briefly about the Enlightenment, and an English guy named Sir Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia, where it was this image of a perfect society, right? Well, in the 19th century, we will have the development of what is known as utopian socialism, using the idea of Karl Marx that the workers will control or should control the means of production of society. They should share in the profits of these societies. Utopian socialism sees the Enlightenment not just working towards ideas of political equality, but also working towards ideas of social equality and economic equality. And we would see some examples pop up in Europe and in America where workers would better be able to share in the profits of their labor rather than merely the industrial ownership class. A prime example of this is a man named Robert Owen, who's a Scottish guy. And Robert Owen would create these factory communities, all right, where all of the laborers within his utopian factory community would share into the profits of that factory, of their production. Robert Owen created a community in Scotland called New Lanark, or Lanark. Not really sure where I put my emphasis on there. New Lanark, L-A-N-A-R-K. Here's a drawing of that. Looks nice, right? Looks utopian. All right. Where the workers and they would all live in a working community, and the workers living in this working community would share into the profits of their labor. He'd eventually come to the United States, and you guys might have heard of his name and the creation of what was known as New Harmony. This might ring a bell from last year, where he developed an industrial community in the United States. These ultimately would not be long-lasting, but they were attempts at this idea of utopian socialism. Now, this doesn't go as far as Karl Marx. Robert Owen was the factory owner. Robert Owen was the guy that developed that. And I'm going to believe that Robert Owen was ultimately leading a better life than the people living within his communities. Whereas Karl Marx didn't advocate for individual factories to be run and owned by individual workers. Karl Marx went further and said that all of the workers, which he called the proletariat, all of the workers should rise up and overthrow the ownership class. Essentially what Karl Marx would say is, hey, you workers, you should be kicking Robert Owen out of the door. You don't need him anymore. All right? That the workers should rise up and take control of the means of production of a society. According to Karl Marx, capitalism, as discussed by Adam Smith, exploited the workers. And he would see a world where eventually those workers would rise up to overcome what he called the ownership class, the bourgeoisie capitalists. And then the workers would control the means of production. They would share in the profits. According to Karl Marx, communism encourages equality and cooperation. And ultimately, governments themselves wouldn't even be necessary. Well, we never really get to that point. And in fact, quite the contrary. In places where communism has actually been attempted, we have extreme government control. the Soviet Union and China and North Korea and Vietnam and Cuba would all employ extreme methods of governmental control over the means of production of society. So it wouldn't be the workers of those societies that are owning the means of production, it would be the government, and the government would decide how that would be controlled. Karl Marx and his ideas would gain some traction in Western Europe, and certainly become the model for the development of a communist state in the Soviet Union, what becomes the Soviet Union, and the model for a communist state in China. But in Western Europe, it doesn't pick up. And there's going to be a good reason for that. There's going to be some push in Western Europe. Oh, here's a little propaganda from the beginning of the Soviet Union, where we have the soldier and the agricultural laborer and the industrial worker all standing side by side as part of this revolutionary movement. All right. In Western Europe and in the United States, we don't see this communist revolution gaining as much traction. And this is going to happen for one big reason. Western Europe and the United States, they're going to allow their citizens some degree of political participation. Their people get to vote. And in the 19th century, the vote, suffrage, right, the right to vote, will expand. In the earliest days, the only people that got to vote, whether it be in Western Europe or in the United States, were those people that, own land. If you owned land, you had a right to vote in early societies. But as we push into the 19th century, we're going to get rid of these ideas that having a vote and being a citizen of a state and having a vote requires having some kind of land or title. And as more people, as more citizens of states of Western Europe get to vote, and even people without land that might be impoverished, and guess what? There are more people in society that don't have much money than there are people in society that have a lot of money. As more people get to vote, as the suffrage is expanded, and we're not talking about universal suffrage yet because women still don't get to do it, but as suffrage is expanded, guess what? More poor people are going to get to vote. And when more poor people get to vote, guess what political candidates will start doing? No. They'll talk to poor people. They'll go to the people that will be likely to vote for them, and they'll say, hey, how about I do some things for you and you vote for me? How about I advocate for better working conditions? How about I advocate for minimum wage laws? How about I advocate for lower working hours or a 5-day work week or anything that the workers might be clamoring for? And the people might say, yeah, we're going to vote for you because you're telling us what we want to hear. We would like to live in a society that has those things. So because Western Europe had an earlier political tradition in the United States of actually having citizens that have a vote in how the society runs, we're going to start to see those societies elect candidates that support some of these improving working conditions of the labor class. All right? So we will see the expansion of the vote beyond the people with land, resulting in political candidates and ultimately politicians that are running these societies that will support improvements in working conditions. Now, one bit of irony here. Some people running these states were absolutely not in support of socialist ideas. They didn't like them. But their hope was, if we throw the workers a bone, if we limit the working hours in a work week, or if we maybe create something like a workers' compensation bill, which if a worker gets hurt on the job, he might get some benefits from the state. If we throw them a few bones, guess what they won't do? They won't revolt. They won't go to socialism. They won't try to overthrow the whole system. So the way we can stay in power, the way we can keep our states, is to give these workers better conditions. And then we will avoid the worst of what we're eventually going to see, for example, in the Russian Revolution. All right? We can silence the socialist protesters by giving them a little bit of what they want. All right? But you, of course, remember, because you guys are little kids and not too far from this, you read a little book when you were younger about giving a mouse a cookie. And if you give a mouse a cookie, he's probably going to want a glass of milk. And if you give him a glass of milk, he's probably going to want universal health care. All right? So these things can expand. These things can expand beyond where they maybe were originally intended. So we will see in Western Europe and in the United States as we push through the 19th century and into the early 20th century, the evolution of child labor laws. Many children your age and younger would not be in schools in the 19th century, but by the early 20th century, these kids can't work in factories anymore. And today, you guys can get a job at McDonald's when you're 16, but you can't work the fry machine because you might burn your little hands. So there's certain jobs you can't do until you are an adult. There will be minimum wage laws. There will be minimum wage laws. We will see minimum wage laws. We will see maximum work week hours. And if you work beyond what eventually becomes the 40-hour work week, you are entitled to overtime pay. We will see the growth of labor unions as states begin to allow the development of labor unions and make it legal for labor unions to collectively bargain for their workers. Collective bargaining. You guys probably, should all ring true from things you learned in APUSH last year, right? Collective bargaining is the idea that workers' rights can be better protected if workers can stand together. The idea that if one worker goes into his boss and says, hey, boss, you know, my working conditions are really lousy and I would like an improvement in them, or I want a little bit more pay. The boss might kick him to the curb because he can be easily replaced in the industrial society when all that guy has to do is this all day. Anybody can come in and do that work. So the ability to collectively bargain is huge for labor unions. That all of the workers could stand together and all go in with maybe a union representation and say, we all, a loud voice, we all want an increase in our wages. The bosses can't as easily eliminate everybody. They can't get rid of an entire workforce. That can't be easily replaced. So collective bargaining laws and labor and protections of labor unions will grow in the late 19th and early 20th century. Yes, sir?
But I remember this from APUSH. There was one steel maker in the United States where he retaliated against one of the...
Absolutely. Yep. Yep.
So he, the way he handled the labor protest that the labor union organized,
yep,
was that he actually locked all the labor people out and
absolutely
brought people in and keep the factory going.
This is going to be an evolution, okay? This is going to be an evolution. Or you also, I think we mentioned the other day, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. The reason the doors were locked was so labor organizers couldn't get in those doors. So this is going to be an evolution. It's not going to happen overnight. And it's really going to take to the 1930s that the labor union movement in the United States especially is going to become quite strong. Yes?
Would you say that central government has more or less power than communism?
Communist governments absolutely exert more power than Western-style capitalist democracies. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So when we have mercantilism, then I thought the kings had a lot of power because they control.
Yep. Yeah. But capitalism is not mercantilism. Yeah. Here's just another drawing that would have popped up, advocating for the 8-hour workday, for 8 hours of recreation that everybody should get to enjoy, not just the wealthy elite, and then 8 hours of rest, whereas many people in the industrial age were working, 16, 18-hour days. Otto von Bismarck from Germany is one important figure that is going to revolutionize the idea of what we today know as the welfare state. Now, welfare, I think today in modern America has a little bit of a negative connotation because there's been people beating up politically on the idea of welfare for the last 30 years in our society. But welfare is just the idea that the state has some responsibility in the welfare of its citizenry. And Otto von Bismarck in Germany in the late 19th century, as the Chancellor of Germany, would begin to create what eventually becomes the modern welfare state. It starts in Germany. Now, of course, the reason he's doing this is to squelch any kind of socialist revolution in Germany. But ultimately what comes out of it is unemployment insurance. If you lose your job, the society will kind of help you out while you're looking for a new job. This still exists to this day across Western Europe and the United States. Healthcare. Germany and all of Western Europe are far further along in providing health care for their populations than the United States is, even though the United States does a lot of it through Medicare programs and Medicaid programs and the new Obamacare legislation. The United States is growing, but we're nowhere near where Western Europe is. Retirement programs. In the United States today, we have a Social Security program. That doesn't come around until the 1930s and Roosevelt's New Deal. Bismarck started those ideas in Germany in the late 19th century. Now, Russian workers, they never got the vote. The Russian Tsar is the most autocratic state on the planet in the late 19th century. The Russian Tsar is holding on to absolute rule in the late 19th century. So Russian citizens didn't have a vote. They didn't have politicians that would support their causes. So we never had any of these improvements to working conditions in Russia like you'll have elsewhere in Europe. So they never got the opportunity to vote, so they never had this kind of reform. The only kinds of reform in Russia would be the reforms that the Tsar would actually allow. In 1881, the Tsar is going to be assassinated in Russia by anarchists. An anarchist believes in anarchy, no government whatsoever. And guys, it makes sense, right? Like if you are living in an absolutely autocratic state, like where one person is ruling you, if you're living in an absolutely autocratic state and there is no hope for political reform whatsoever, what do you probably believe is a better solution than what you're living in? No government is better than the government we're living in. Yes?
What did you say you existed?
This is 1881. So we have the growth, not just in Russia, there's going to be pockets of anarchism in Western Europe and in the United States as well, but a growth in the late 19th century of an anarchy movement, an anarchist movement, that will result in the assassination of one of the czars of Russia. And it won't be the last, but that comes for a different reason. We also see in Russia a stronger rise in Karl Marx's ideas of a communist revolution, of a revolution of the workers. And this is led by a group of people known as the Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
The Bolsheviks, Bolsheviks. That is a lot of excitement for Bolshevism. Which is led by a guy named Vladimir Lenin. We will talk more about him later in the year, but Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution is ultimately successful in Russia in 1917. And Russia will become the communist Soviet Union. So these things happen in, like if someone were to ask you, why does this happen in Russia, but it doesn't happen in Western Europe? Because the Russians didn't get the chance to ever vote for political leadership that might offer better working conditions for their people. Good? Good. We're going to press. Some states are going to outright work to oppose and avoid modernization and industrialization. And it ultimately will lead to their demise. All right? In China, the traditional Confucianism of China says what about the merchant class?
Bad people.
They're the mean people of society, right? They're not respected within society because they don't create. They only work to increase their own wealth. So naturally, the capitalist industrial model in China is not going to pick up much steam. Pardon the pun. It's not going to pick up much steam in China. I know, that was bad. So China is in the 19th century attempting to close its doors to the outside world and remain traditionalist in its economy. Another society that's going to resist change, at least early on, is the Ottoman Empire. Here's the extent of the Ottoman Empire in the early 19th century. The Ottoman Empire has its roots in a traditional landed aristocracy. Wealth is still derived in the Ottoman Empire from land ownership. And those aristocratic elites in the Ottoman Empire who are also deeply connected to the military elite in the Ottoman Empire, this Janissary Corps in the Ottoman Empire, they're going to be very reluctant to hand over power in their society to wealthy industrialists. They don't want to give up what they have. Because remember, once you industrialize, the traditional landed elite lose their power because the new industrial class becomes much wealthier. So both in Qing China and in the Ottoman Empire, they're going to resist. Now, two places that recognize that resistance is futile, that if they don't industrialize, they will collapse, they will be overrun by the West. We're going to talk about Russia and then Japan. While Russia is not going to be granting its citizens the right to vote in the 19th century, they will absolutely try to industrialize. It's later than Western Europe does it, but they will try to catch up. And much of that is led by a finance minister named Sergei Witte, W-I-T-T-E. He's a Russian guy, but he's got kind of a Germany name. Remember, Russia used to be a little bigger. And he was the Russian finance minister that's going to be a proponent and a supporter of Russian industrialization. And much of that comes with the creation of what eventually is going to be the Trans-Siberian Railroad, but also railroads that stretch and connect other major cities in Russia to the resource-rich areas of eastern Russia. By 1900, Russia will become the fourth biggest steel producer on the planet, behind England and Germany and the United States. But they're going to rapidly industrialize. In 1861, Russia will emancipate their serfs. The serf in Russia was akin to the slave in the United States, where serfs were literally tied to their, not literally tied to their land, I'm improperly using the word literally. They were figuratively tied to their land. They were owned, essentially, by landowners, right? In 1861, the institution of the serf is going to be ended in Russia. And the hope was that that would free up people that could become industrial laborers in urban areas. You should note, in 1861, the serfdom is ended in Russia. In 1865, slavery is ended in the United States. All right, so these are happening at virtually the same time. 1861. Yes, ma'am?
You said that by 1900 Russia is the fourth biggest steel producer on the planet.
Yeah.
But then the Bolshevik Revolution was in 1917.
Yes.
So do they start to industrialize before?
Yes. Yes. They start to industrialize before the revolution. But what never happened in Russia was the Tsar never gave up control of the government. The Tsar, for a time, there's going to be a parliament created in Russia, but it's a very weak parliament, and normal people, everyday people in Russia, people that got to vote in Western Europe and the United States, they're not going to enjoy that in Russia. All right? Last thing we're going to talk about before we go to lunch is Japan. In 1868, and we will talk more about this later, but in 1868, Japan has what's known as the Meiji Restoration. Meiji, M-E-I-J-I. The Meiji Restoration. Meiji Restoration. It's the restoration of the power of the emperor over the shogun in Japan. The Meiji Restoration. Do we recall that in the 1600s, the Tokugawa shogunate ushered in a couple centuries of Japanese isolation, right? Centralization of Japan, but isolation of Japan. By 1868, Japan sees the writing on the wall. We're going to talk about this more at a later date. But Japan says, if we don't industrialize, we are going to become like China. And China's being dominated now by the West. So Japan, with the Meiji Restoration, will move to westernize and industrialize. For example, if we look at this drawing that comes out of Japan in the late 19th century, we see a lot of people wearing Western-style clothing. All right? They're going to adopt Western, not only clothes, but Western industry and Western management practices. So Japan will move to westernize. turn completely 180 degrees from where they were when they wanted to be an isolationist nation. And in fact, Japan in the late 19th century will begin to look elsewhere, to the United States and to Western Europe, to learn how to build their factories, to learn how to establish Western-style schools. And by 1900, Japan will be the most industrialized Asian state. By 1905, Japan will defeat Russia in war. By 1914, Japan will join the Allied powers in the First World War to defeat Germany. And by 1931, Japan will start making its empire that ultimately leads to World War II in the Pacific and an eventual attack of the United States. Yeah, Manchuria in 1931. But we will get to all those things later, but just know that Japan, along with Russia, moved to industrialize. Whereas the Ottoman Empire and the Qing dynasty in China, they were resistant to industrialization.